Okay, so we will begin. I'm going to begin just by sharing some of our Cullen St Gabriel's strategy and links to research at the current time before Kevin explains a little bit more about our specific projects at the moment. So I'm just going to share my screen with you, hopefully. Okay. So it's been fantastic working for Cullen St Gabriel's for just over a year now. And I'm just going to share with you a little bit about our new vision and where the Trust is going and how research fits into that going forward. So some of you will probably have seen this already online. It's our new vision for the Trust. I won't read it out, but just to say that I think what we are showing here is that religion and worldviews as a subject in schools is not an end in itself. We want to see excellent religion and worldviews education, but actually we want to see that because we want it to contribute to a well-informed, respectful and open society. And the difference that we can make as a trust, as a charity, is really important. So that's what we're all about. That's our vision for the future. And so as a trust, we've been thinking about, well, what is our specific role to play in bringing about that particular vision? So we have 6 mission statements, and we're working towards all of these 6 things here over the coming years. And you will notice here that they go from kind of the really broad at the top, where it talks about public understanding, right through at the bottom of that list to where it talks about inspired and well-resourced teaching and learning. So actually the teacher in the school themselves. And then kind of everything in between, from policymakers, so people like the DFE and ministers and so on, through to educationalists, so people who run, say, multi-academy trusts or who are involved with unions and so on as well. So our mission has these different strands, and our strategic goals link to each of those. And these are our strategic objectives for the next 3 years. These very clearly align with our mission and are very specific towards wanting to develop particular things. We're particularly interested in public perception of an education in religion and worldviews, as well as actually making sure that our religion and worldviews community works really cohesively together. That's why it's such a great joy to work with AULRE on the programme yesterday and today. We're bringing people together, and it's such a privilege to be able to do that and work with different parts of the RE community. So those are our objectives, and we've got short sort of year 1 goals linked to each of those, as well as plans for across the 3 years itself too. So where's the place of research within this? Because we haven't got a specific strategic objective linked to research, and there's a very good reason for that. We're not going to have a distinct programme for research. There won't be a new Research 7. You'll hear Kevin talk about the Research 7 in a few minutes. But instead, because research is so important to us as a trust, it's going to be threaded through the different strategic objectives, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Also, research is going to be particularly focused on enabling the trust to fulfil its strategic objectives, mission, and work towards its vision. So it's going to become much more strategic in terms of the type of research that we might fund and support. There are also really strong research elements in other programmes. So, for example, we met this morning, actually, the Pilot Leadership Steering Group, and we're talking about research there. It's a really strong element of that programme. We also have a newly formed Master's Scholarship Programme, which was previously called the 3 for RE scheme. And we're really excited about the developments within that programme, particularly to bring early career researchers and teachers doing research together. And lastly, research forms a part of our Teach RE course as well. There's a module there on research specifically. Something else which might be of interest is that we are considering bringing the Research for RE website within RE Online, again, to demonstrate the fact that research is really important, particularly for serving teachers. RE Online is particularly aimed at serving teachers, particularly leaders in schools of the subject. And so we want to show that research is fundamental to that. So we're looking at a way of bringing the website for research into RE Online. And then lastly, grants will still be awarded for research as they have been previously. But as I've said, they'll be focused on our strategic objectives and working towards those. So here are some examples of the ways in which research might be threaded through some of our strategic objectives going forward. So, for example, in relation to public perception, we might ask the question, well, what already exists? What research already exists around public perception? We already know there's some out there, but what else needs to be done in order to establish a baseline, but then also to change public perception? And then in a similar way, what research already exists about the importance of an education in religion and worldviews, and how do we disseminate that better? So how do we utilise some of that research? And is there further research? I think there probably is further research needed on the importance and value and the impact that the subject has on children and young people. So how can we go about developing and thinking about that? And then lastly, what research do teachers want to see? Some of us met with a group of teachers recently when we were thinking about our research strategy going forward, to find out what exactly they wanted research on. And that was really interesting. And we're going to build and develop on some of that later. So the Master's Scholarship Programme I referred to a few minutes ago obviously has research at its heart. It's about developing excellent leadership in schools, particularly those that are leading on religion and worldviews in the classroom. We've made some significant changes to this programme, and you can read about them online. I'm not going to go through them all now, but we're really excited about developing a community of young researchers together. And again, I mentioned our pilot leadership programme, and teachers who are taking part in that are becoming actively involved in research. I know some of you are here this afternoon because I have seen you, and it's great that actually you're engaging with the research that Bob and Paul are going to share with us this afternoon. We're also really excited about developing a relationship with a chartered college who place a great emphasis on research-informed practice as well. And then obviously working with AULRE and with ARIAC as well as part of that programme. So I'm going to finish there. I will have a look and see if there's any chat questions that have come up about what I presented, but also feel free later on in the plenary if there's particular questions that you have. We're going to share some more about our strategic objectives and short-term goals over the coming weeks. I've actually just been preparing a blog for probably next Friday to go out, talking about the first two of our strategic objectives, giving a little bit more information on what those two will look like. But we're really excited as a trust about where things are going from now. So I can't see any questions in the chat at this stage. So I'm going to hopefully hand over to Kevin, who is going to share a little bit about our Research 7 projects. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everybody. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief update on the Research 7 series of projects. I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about the background to Research 7. As many of you are aware, the project series emerged from a consultation that the Trust did in 2017 with its key partner organisations, including AULRE and NATRE also. And the purpose of the consultation was to identify the key research areas for RE over the next 2 to 3 years. And 7 areas were identified. Most of the projects were then funded through bids to Column St. Gabriel's, and the series then began, with different projects beginning at different points over the 2-year period. So I'll go through the 7 areas one by one, just to indicate where each one is up to now. So we need slide 2 now, Catherine, please.
Yeah, it's there, Kevin, for you.
And yeah, I can see it now, thanks. So area 1 was curriculum design. And Richard Kueh, then, of the Inspiration Trust, took on the leadership of this research area for us. The project was quite brief. It was around 6 months in duration. Richard had an initial 1-day forum for his trust's RE leads, and then implemented a knowledge-rich religion and philosophy curriculum in the trust's academies. They produced an agreed document, a curriculum statement, and a program of study for religion and philosophy in Key Stage 3. On the back of these initiatives, Richard then went and did a presentation at the 2020 conference and some other conference presentations. The link that you can see on the screen is to a blog within RE Online by Neil McCain about Richard's 2020 presentation, which is a very interesting blog, and I'd recommend that to you. Because within this area, thus far, we've really only had a small scale project. I think this could well be an area to which we'll return, particularly because in the focus group that we held with teachers recently, and as a part of that, we asked teachers about the kinds of areas, research areas, that they'd seek more sort of information and guidance through. Curriculum design, curriculum development was one that came through strongly. So moving on to area 2, this was religious literacy, and we funded 2 projects within this area. The first one was done by Dave Aldridge, Gert Beester, Pat Hannam and Sean Whittle. It lasted from September 2018 to March 2019 and consisted of a literature review, an academic summit that was held over 2 days in early 2019, followed shortly by a teachers' meeting that took place in Hampshire, various conference presentations, including at last year's AULRE, and a very good Journal of Beliefs and Values article, the link for which you can see on the screen in front of you. Now, the JBV article was quite closely connected to the original project report, which we house on RE Online. Again, the link for that is there. You can read that on the website. You can download it from there. It's a really, really good piece of work. And I would say, becoming more and more well read, well received and useful to people. So for example, as a trust, we recently referred to it in a submission that we made to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Religion in the Media, who've, as you may be aware, had a call recently for evidence on religious literacy. The second project that we have funded in the area of religious literacy is called Innovative Spaces of RE for Real. It's being led by Adam Dinham and Martha Shaw. It began last September. Now it was scheduled to complete this September. With the current uncertainty, whether or not that will happen now is unsure. I mean, I doubt it personally. However, it's a really interesting piece of work. What's happening is the case studies of the RE for Real approach are being developed in, it's now 5 schools actually, with the methodology including video interviews with teachers and pupils, also videotaping lessons. A project film is now in production where the various bits of footage are being added together into something coherent. There was a House of Lords based showcasing event scheduled around this project for July, which I would say almost certainly now will need to be put back, but really interesting work going on there. So watch this space for more developments on innovative spaces of RE for real. So areas 3 and 4, really we're going to hear more about in the more detailed presentations this afternoon. So I'm only going to mention them. I'm not really going to describe them or say very much about them at all. But area 3 is emergent technologies in RE, which Paul will pick up and talk about later on in this session. And area 4 is teachers and texts, which Bob will talk about in the presentation after mine. So moving on to area 5 and children as scientific and religious researchers, Culham St Gabriel has actually decided against awarding grants in this area. And the reason for the decision was that a whole lot of interesting research was already being done under the Templeton Big Questions in Classroom series. So what we decided to do strategically was to sort of keep an eye on those projects instead of funding projects of our own within those areas. So that particular project series will be strongly represented at our forthcoming REXChange conference, which we still hope will be a face-to-face conference event, and it's scheduled for October the 3rd at the University of Birmingham. So for example, Pearce and Alexis Stones are scheduled to present on the work on epistemic literacy at that event. So are Nigel Fancourt and Liam Guilfoyle in relation to their argumentation in Science and RE project. And we are also expecting presentations from Berry Billingsley and Stephen Pett at REXChange. So moving on now to area 6. Originally, this had the somewhat copious title of Educational Disadvantage, Social Mobility and Religious Identity. It was led over a year by David Lundie, and probably owing largely to feedback that we had at last year's AULRE conference, the project title was adapted, narrowed, clarified to Religious Education and Social Disadvantage. That happened in May of 2019. The work is really, really interesting. So there are 2 strands to it. In the first, some survey data from 6 secondary schools, all of which are in economically deprived areas, were analysed. And the data are about pupil and parent views and experiences of the value of RE. In the second strand, the community of practice was formed to look at enhancing primary RE throughout of classroom learning, really concerning visits to and from different faith communities within Liverpool. And again, the focus was schools that served socially disadvantaged children. I can't say too much about the 2 data sets because both are currently in articles that are under submission to journals. But you can find out more by attending REXChange. Again, it's really, really interesting. Potentially transformative work, I think. So moving on to area 7 now. Again, this is an area where we're funding 2 separate but potentially very much related projects. In the first, Viv Baumfield and Karen Walsh have been carrying out a mapping review which aims to set out what we currently know about how teachers engage with research. When I say that this is general, I mean it's not yet specifically focused on RE. The mapping review is completed and the write-up is in progress. What was then scheduled to happen was a series of focus groups which would kind of bring this data sharply within the lens of RE teaching. So a focus group that represented English RE teachers was planned, and a second one that represented Welsh RE teachers. And the idea would have been to get some data on how and whether the general findings from the mapping review affect RE specifically. Now, at the moment, for obvious reasons, we can't hold focus groups. So what Viv and Karen have done is altered the plan slightly in line with this to online interviews with individual teachers. And those are happening this month and will continue to happen next month. And then the second project within Area 7 is being led by Emma Salter. It has the same time frame as the first project within Area 7, i.e. it began last September, was scheduled to finish this September, but obviously we'll have to see about that now. And here we have a community of practice, practitioner research community of practice that includes 9 primary RE colleagues and 2 academics. And the concept of the teacher as problem solver is really, really key within this project. So the 2 academics are there, not to instruct the teachers as such, but to support their research investigations. And the aim is to get a rich series of case studies of classroom or curricular interventions written up in reflective teacher researcher journals. And the themes span visits to faith communities, teaching about texts, arts-based approaches to RE, effective subject leadership and CPD, and commission implementation from a head teacher perspective, given that 2 of the colleagues within the community of practice are primary heads. So obviously, again, this is a project that's had to adapt to the current circumstances, and the community of practice stays in contact through virtual meetings, but the school-based work has had to be postponed. It may now, it's likely, I guess, have to be picked back up in September, and the project timescale then extended. That would be fine, but we'll just have to see where we are with that later, I think. So just moving to some conclusions about series rather than individual project outputs now. And we have 2 main ones in mind, really. The first is the REXChange conference, into which we've been putting a lot of thought and preparation. That, as I said earlier, we hope will still be a face-to-face conference event in October in Birmingham. All of the projects and several interesting others will be represented, and most of the projects will be spoken about by a researcher and a teacher pair of presenters, because what we're really trying to do at this event is to get a genuine exchange of knowledge and ideas between researchers and practitioners, between room practice, a bidirectionality. And when we mention practitioners, of course, teachers are very, very important within that group, but we're hoping to include advisors and others from the kind of practitioner community there. So the link to the event is on our website, and we'd strongly urge you to look at that, to get involved, to talk with us about our planning for it, and to register as delegates, please. The second series output will be a special issue of the British Journal of Religious Education on teachers' engagement in and with research, which will appear in late 2021. It's not strictly a Research 7 series output, but it's certainly been stimulated by Research 7. And I can now say more than representation from Research 7 will be expected, in that the editorial team accepted a series of abstracts last week, and we accepted 9, within which, you know, there is considerable Research 7 representation. So though I shouldn't say too much about it at this stage, it's quite clear that the project series will form a considerable part of that publication. So having mentioned that, I think that's about it from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's been a really busy couple of years on these particular projects, and we're really excited about showcasing them in October. I've just put in the chat that even if it's not a face-to-face event, it will be done online. So we'd really encourage you to sign up, because it will really help us to plan for the event, even if it has to happen in a virtual way. So do encourage you to go and register for that. I don't have any questions at this stage, Kevin, for you, but just to say to everyone, please do, again, in the plenary, if you've got questions that you want to pose to Kevin or myself, then please do come back and do that then. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand over to Bob, who's going to share his research, and Stephen is going to chair questions and things for Bob at the end of that. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks very much. So if I'm doing this correctly, you should see a couple of pictures of the project Texts and Teachers. I'm Professor Bob Bowie. I'm based at Canterbury Christ Church University, and the project I'm talking about was a collaboration with University College London with Farid Pandwani, and I was assisted both by Katie Clemmy, but also with a team of other people who I mention a little bit for in this presentation. It's lovely to be able to speak to you this afternoon, and I think I should say that what I'm giving is about 10 minutes or just under 10 minutes on the broader context and Texts and Teachers, and perhaps what it might say, how it might speak into the worldview education conversation. And then in the second half, I'm going to talk about some of the findings from the project. And I should say that, oh, I meant to show you, that's a photograph of me and Farid, and that's a web page that you can go to where you can get access to the reports. You can follow the links through the Texts and Teachers links, and in due course there'll be some videos on there as well, and there are other resources related to this and other projects, so you can download all of those at your leisure, or leisure, depending on how you pronounce it. Okay, so to begin then, an advisor, one of our advisors to the project, Dr. Margaret Carswell of Australian Catholic University, got a picture of her too, there she is on the left. She's a leading scholar in research in teaching sacred texts. She says that sacred texts are messages wrapped in words. And she thinks we can learn rich things by understanding the context in which the texts are written and read, the context in which they are found to have meaning in communities, and the context for the pupil or student who reads them now in their worldview. Everyone can reflect on their own encounter with text, whatever their background or belief. And of course, some texts in particular have had an enduring impact on the world and its communities, sometimes in dramatic ways. For me, hermeneutics is clearly a project of Ezra, the time of the Babylonian Empire, as he reflected with his religious community on how they were to make sense of their separation from Jerusalem and the narrative of Moses. And I was reminded of that when I was watching a lesson last year in a school in a corner of London, and the lesson turned to Martin Luther King, and particularly the words where he reflected on the Moses narrative in his seminal speech in the history of civil rights. So he was repeating that practice developed by Ezra and others. And as the lesson started to draw to a close, in what was mostly a BAME multi-religious class of young scholars, one pupil began to reflect on her own life and wondered if those words had new meaning for her in her context. And it struck me at that moment that I was witnessing this turning spiral of contextualization and recontextualization, and actually the practice of rereadership in the scholars in front of me, as old words provoked meanings newly revealed to them. To take another starting point, symbolic meaning clearly mattered for Origen in the early centuries of Christianity in the interpretation of Genesis, as it was later for Calvin. And we were all reminded of this by one of our other project advisors, and there is Mike Otter standing next to Katie Clemmy, and this resource in particular, which was one of the resources, the one in the middle there, the creation narratives, which he was developing at the time, and we drew on for in the project with the participants. Now, from the Bible Society, and Bible Society supported the project as well. That's available for download now for free. For sure, the modern science religion debate and the puzzle around that has been provoking discussion actually for millennia, and text interpretation and symbolic imagination play important roles in that discussion. And as my co-researcher, Dr. Farah Pandwani from UCL's Centre for the Study of Education in Muslim Contexts would remind us, this is not a matter exclusive to Christianity. Consider the ways different Muslim cultures and communities reflect and interpret their sacred texts on matters of religious dress or the application of law and many other things. So this is not some newfangled, recently invented intellectual leap, nor is it not relevant enough, not lived religion enough, as it clearly relates to critical contemporary matters of religion and belief in modern life that have public significance for our citizens. I think our subject is riven with hermeneutics. If only we would draw it out and see it plainly. But too often in RE, sacred texts are encountered in fragments, decontextualized from their settings, and frequently used in clobber debates. There was a recent, and literally it was last week I saw this, a recent TikTok video that someone shared on one of the social media, professional social media platforms. I think it was Facebook, but it could have been Twitter. And in it, it was made by a student in sort of putting himself in an RS exam, trying desperately hard not to use the love thy neighbor quote in the question. He was trying to think of any other quote he could use, and he sits there trying to resist what he knows will be a complete integrity collapse, because that quote could be used for any question. And in the end, he gives up to the inevitable. He can't think of another thing to say. And I think that points to the fact that our students know what we know. Any approach to our subject which doesn't take seriously the scholarship of the study of it is arguably one of the world's most significant narratives. That's not an approach with integrity. Now, this is not a particularly new observation, that point. There are many reports and studies. I could have shown you a list of, I think, 25 different research projects, papers, publications, which throw up significant warning messages around what we're doing to sacred text study, or what we're being expected to do, or asked to do, or required to do, and raising questions about whether we're really learning from the discipline and the scholarship of this study. And it's not enough just to hear that. You've got to respond and reflect and maybe change your practice in some way. Now, the other angle of this I just wanted to reflect on was from the Commission of RE final report, which inspired us because of words given central status in the definition of worldview. So I'm quoting here: a worldview is a person's way of understanding, experiencing, and responding to the world. It can be described as a philosophy of life or an approach to life, how a person understands. Now that is on page 4, but repeated on page 26, and then unpacked, and then further unpacked on 72. So on page 29, the report says, relates way of understanding directly to disciplinarity, and it mentions sacred text scholarship. It says, the explicit academic study of worldviews provides an opportunity to develop a range of specific and transferable skills that are intrinsic to the disciplines involved in the study of worldviews, include analyzing a range of primary and secondary sources, understanding symbolic language, using technical terminology, interpreting meaning and significance, empathy, and so on. And this is central to our understanding of diversity. And just on the next page, the report goes on to identify how important it is for making sense of different communities in interpretation. And let me read again. It says, there's now a greater recognition that within each of major traditions, there are different communities of interpretation and different theological and philosophical approaches. And as another advisor to our project was Professor Towie, director of the Aquinas Centre at St Mary's University, and also one of the commissioners. And he reminded us that the approach that you take to interpreting a text is often a key to unlocking a self-understanding and the practice of denominations today. There's a relationship between those things, certainly within Christianity in a major way, but not just Christianity. The report continues that in the subject there needs to be a significant rebalancing of the how of worldview with the what of worldview. This is page 31. How worldviews work in practice is as important as knowing the content of particular worldviews. So there is, within the proposition of the Commission, a proposal that contains effectively a hermeneutical term for the subject. But if we don't somewhere provide the building blocks for hermeneutical understanding, then maybe worldview education will be impossible. And I do think sacred text study is central for doing that and for our understanding of hermeneutics. So this is why we thought it mattered to do the project. Text and Teachers was a project pilot study, 10 teachers in 7 contrasting schools who took a more hermeneutical approach to their classrooms, applying some professional development in their own areas of curricula and adapting a sequence of lessons. The study was focused on teachers, their perspectives, and their experiences of their classrooms. I've mentioned the 2 free online outputs, the findings report, which has an accessible summary on the interviews and also with the participants, and a practice guide. And the practice guide has got some of the material which we further developed, which was used to support the professional development side of the project. And that offers teachers and curriculum writers development ideas for more hermeneutical RE. So we hope that will help teachers and curriculum writers. And these are all available, as I said, through the NICER website. I'd like to specifically pay tribute to all of the people involved in this project, especially my colleague, Ms. Katie Clemmy, and for her support with the teachers, but also other advisors to the ones I've mentioned. This is including Dr. Philip Wood of Aga Khan University and Dr. Lynn Revell, our reader in religion and education in my own university at Canterbury Christ Church. And I'm delighted that my research centre, which is the National Institute for Christian Education Research, has been able to work with this rich, diverse group of people. It's very significant to me that this was a multi-worldview project team. So, if I'm still on target, just about, though that's the broader setting, I want to say something about key findings and also just perhaps a little bit more on that. Now, when I reread the transcripts and listened again to the recordings, it was clear that there are these essential insights and tensions. Several features of what many of the participants said stand out as reflecting what's possible if we were to take hermeneutics and worldview education seriously, perhaps rather than so much the status quo. So first of all, it is doable, irrespective of pupil population, whether in poor or wealthy socioeconomic settings, whether in, well, how can I put it, faithy or largely nons pupil populations. The teachers that taught hermeneutically had experiences of something different or rich in their classrooms. Sometimes they described it as a quality they hadn't seen before. And that was true for quite long experienced teachers. 3 had well over 15 years experience each. So given that this is on the back of relatively few hours of CPD in hermeneutics, albeit of course the backgrounds of those teachers and their own expertise that they brought, it's still striking that it gave them, or there was a sense of an unlocking experience. A door opening was the phrase that one participant used as a phrase to describe what was happening for their students. Someone else said there were conversations that the year 7s were having that seemed to go deeper than some of the questions in year 11 GCSE exams were going to allow. Several participants expressed surprise at how pupils of widely differing levels of achievement responded positively to the study of longer texts. This may be because narrative is easier to become familiar than long propositions or quotes. I mean, there's a whole side talk in the idea of human memory and narrative structures and the fact that maybe narratives are more straightforward to put to memory. Secondly, it can be multi-religious. There were 2 schools that found they were able to apply scholarship of sacred text studies, which they began within Christian texts and then moved into Muslim sacred text lessons. And they grew in confidence about that. It began with some anxiety about that, but became confident. So there you have progression across 2 religions, but within a single discipline. This might be a very significant possibility in that it opens up religious and worldview diversity within a single disciplinary pattern. Thirdly, it decolonizes. I think this shows sacred text studies need not be narrow or exclusive, and this could open up a very significant possibility for the subject. Some of the previous attempts at bringing in external disciplines to the study of religion have had the consequence of colonizing the content with external concepts and ideas that sort of have the result of converting rather than translating the subject matter. I think that's an error that leads to every worldview being looked at coming into a sort of version of a liberal, acceptable type of religion, or something that has just equivalencies to some basic starting point. A lot has been written about that, of course, by many of colleagues. Next, it is disciplinary, of course. Previously in RE, we tended to be presented with a choice between study within a religious tradition, which some would have called confessional, or study from the objective afar, which some would have called professional, academic. I don't think that language is very helpful. I think we need to start somewhere else, and discipline, and starting with a discipline, I think, is an option. And this asks a key question for curriculum writers, because it affects how we structure the curricula, of course. Is it time to develop sacred text programs of study that cross 2 or maybe 3 traditions, rather than compartmentalizing the different religions or using themes which owe little to disciplinarity and more to some kind of immanent frame that colonizes the content? That's an oblique reference to some work of Charles Taylor that some of you might have come across. Next, I think it's holistic and humanistic. And this came from the observations from a number of, well, 3 participants that showed the interplay between student personal worldview and institutional worldview and academic study. So here's one example. A Catholic sixth form student had what the RE teacher participant described as a very important conversation as he was introduced to symbolic meaning and non-literal interpretations, which the Catholic tradition endorses and includes within its hermeneutics, which have multiple dimensions. And that comes from the ancient tradition of the quadriga. So this teenager hadn't encountered this before, and the introduction of it was actually quite troubling. It was a bit disruptive. They had tended to adopt a more literal reading of the Bible, which they had assumed was normative and the reading. And that was what they thought the tradition they were a part of, the Catholic Christian tradition they were a part of, expected of them. So what we had there is critical engagement within a faith-based approach to the subject that was also disciplinary, that was made possible because of the critical disciplinary dimension. And here I also, to give another example, I just want to name check the recently and most sadly deceased Bill Gent, who died just recently, and his work in madrasa education. And there was a sort of similar kind of point of the interaction that he observed in that where he was aware that RE teachers might find themselves being the people who for the first time brought translations of the Quran to their students, their Muslim students, and Muslim students who maybe were experts at recitation, but hadn't necessarily been introduced to translation because they had been taught to recite Arabic, not taught to translate Arabic. It is critical. Well, that's kind of obvious from that point. But in another school, a participant teacher commented on how children had been introduced in church primary school. They'd only been reduced to literal readings of the Bible. And although most of these children are not Christian, this coloured their view of all religions' readings of scripture, such that the introduction to sacred text scholarship in Year 7 came as a surprise. Now, one of our advisors, Margaret Carswell, has argued repeatedly for the importance of hermeneutical approaches to sacred text study in primary RE classrooms in her publications and projects with many schools in the UK and Australia. And just to say, if you think, oh, that sounds a bit crazy, Margaret has worked with small children and teachers of small children for 20 years. So this comes from deep experience. And she develops methods of introducing historical critical hermeneutics with 5-year-olds. And the kind of hermeneutics she does with primary English, with primary children, English examinations curricula don't mention specifically until A-level religious studies. I'll just leave that one there. In the third school, a participant teacher reported that a pupil had gone home after studying hermeneutics and later said to the teacher they'd opened up and reread some of their own religion's sacred texts and thought about that. And this was a student from an East Asian religious tradition. They found that a positive and a helpful thing. So we have a transfer going on between school curricula and personal knowing. I think these examples show how and why the separation between the personal and the so-called objective, which intellectually I think is quite weak, I don't think that can stand up in how we think about our subject. We need to be we need a sensitively and professionally managed relationship in those areas, not segregation. And I think many RE teachers know that well. And the last thing I wanted to say a bit about was really the GCSE issue. Now, the GCSE issue stood in the background to this project because we were very conscious of the consequence of GCSE question structures and specification on sacred text, and also the massive decline in the numbers of people doing the sacred text paper, partly because of the reorganization of the subject. Most of the participants made 2 kinds of observations about the GCSEs from their own work on the project. First, they saw that an understanding of the hermeneutic of sacred text could help students explain difference and so write better long answer questions in evaluation questions, which obviously would be very important. Now, this is their perception, but some of them were saying they were already translating techniques they had developed at Key Stage 3. This was a Key Stage 3 project. They were translating those into GCSE. And I think that underscores precisely the words of the Commission about why the how matters of worldview. So the pilot study identifies a possible positive gain from teaching sacred text scholarship in the current GCSE system. Hermeneutical RE can be good for grades. Hooray. Second, they saw a significant omission in examination design, which doesn't foreground sacred text scholarship and disciplinarity as something to be specifically included in the specification or recognized in the grading system and question structures. I realize that's quite a complex point, but there you've got it. One participant felt students could do very well without any sense of symbolic meaning under the current system. So the TikTok video of the student critiquing the ludicrous kind of dumbed down practice that you will learn one quote and apply it to loads. And by the way, that's not a criticism of teachers, but it's perhaps an accentuation or exaggeration of the way things are set out. So you end up being able to kind of use one point to make a generalized point about anything. The prioritization of the sources of wisdom authority in GCSE is a step forward. But without specific space for the scholarship of sacred studies practice within the relevant tradition, the real gain will be hard to achieve, and the dangers of an undue influence of proof texting will continue to limit and damage the education of students. And this really undermines what's professed as a multidisciplinarity in the examination doctrines. There's a lot of a sort of tribute to multidisciplinarity, but actually that's a bit of a myth, because the real structure is found in the question design. The question design sets the structure and replaces the disciplinary structure. So for the moment, it's accidentally the case that students with a more hermeneutical kind of study could show better exam answers. But surely this should be hardwired into the fabric of the exam system. Perhaps we thought of as the mathematical method value that maths exams will have. The Commission final report, which for the how to matter as much as the what in our subject, will falter without due recognition and attention to exams. So this is a small-scale pilot study, 7 schools, 10 teachers, but it relates to an international field of scholarship with detailed and sustained work in Australia, Europe, the Americas, as well as the UK. And I believe the insights I've outlined flow from the work of many colleagues. If I was to provide a kind of family tree of all of the thinking that has gone into this, I think it would be dozens of people. What next? Well, here are just a few things. First of all, it would be really interesting to understand what the impact on children are of the explicit teaching of hermeneutics. What does it do to what they imagine might be possible, how they might conceptualize, what their attitude might be to either fundamental questions or worldviews themselves? What happens when you explicitly develop a multidisciplinary, multidimensional meaning of reality that includes the symbolic? I'm thinking about that particularly at primary school, because by the time they get to the end of upper primary school, there's evidence, my colleagues in the LASAR team and the work done by Barry Billingsley points to this, there's evidence that children are already have an understanding that you have to choose between science and religion, and that then grows into secondary school. So what happens if we introduce notions of the symbolic understanding? There's growing evidence that the foundations of broad sacred text scholarship needs to be taught and developed in primary schools. And of course, there's a lot of evidence that it can be done so. It shouldn't be the case that non-literal reading of sacred texts are only introduced in secondary school. This could, for example, lead students to conclude that one has to make that choice between science and religion. Okay, what about a reworking of religion and worldview Key Stage 3 curricula to allow sacred text scholarship as a discipline to be taught across more than one religion? Could we make that case to the relevant curriculum authorities? And this would require a shift in the imagination of in how we see the exam. A former teacher of mine, John Moffat from the Society of Jesus, says, could we imagine the study of the Book of Job and the Bhagavad Gita in combination? They're interesting texts that have similarities. Could we imagine that taking place in a module in a term? And he was thinking about a Catholic context when he was talking about that. But actually, we could. Well, what would be wrong with doing that in any school context? There are other things I could say about theology and religious studies, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to sort of finish there and just say a couple of things, which is I really want to invite teachers, university tutors, people in positions of authority in our systems, in publishing, in voluntary organisations to join in this hermeneutical push. I've done quite a lot of writing on the scholarship, reviewing the scholarship that's looked at the problems around sacred text teaching. And I could confidently tell you that I've got 25 years of research reports on this issue. And as we think about what our subject's going to be like in future, it'd be really good if in another 25 years' time, we don't have another long list of criticisms and studies that show that we have not yet sorted this out in our exam design, in our curriculum design. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. I've been keeping track on the chat line. Emma Salter has a good number of questions to ask Bob. So Bob, there are three issues. I think we've not got a great deal of time. One, Emma's got a couple of questions for you. People would like to know just a wee bit more about Margaret Carswell. They're very interested in her work. And the third issue would be primary schools, how this can be done in primary schools. So Emma, can I invite you to ask your question wherever you are?
Yep. Hey everyone. Thanks, Bob. I was looking for the clap button, but this platform doesn't have a clap button. So yeah, well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
My question, Bob, is about teacher confidence with the method. So your teachers received a bit of CPD training. Did they need that? Would they have been confident with the method without that? How confident were they in applying hermeneutics? And was there any variance on teacher confidence regarding if they were teaching about a text they were already very, very familiar with themselves, or if they were teaching a text that was maybe quite unfamiliar to them? Thank you.
Okay, a lot of questions in there. I think I'm going to say a couple of things. First of all, they received a day and a half of CPD input, the same, but they were brought together as a group, and then they received a series of evenings of we call them the book clubs. There were 5 of those, and then there was also some individual to and fro email support as they were applying. So they did receive that sort of support, which probably sounds like a lot now, but when I started teaching was pretty small, because 6 days of study CPD was quite normal, and we didn't go anywhere near 6 days of input. That's perhaps something more general about the context for teachers. We didn't quantitatively seek to measure confidence levels, so I can't give you stats, but what I can say is that there were significant reservations raised at the outset, but these were teachers who had put themselves forward and were prepared to try things out. And for example, there were specific concerns raised about the transfer to Muslim sacred texts, and 2 of the schools did try to do that and felt they were doing that quite well, and felt quite that was a success. I can't really give you a scientific answer to the question of what would have happened if we hadn't done that. I don't know. I don't know how I'd have measured that. So I can't answer that question. And I think that what struck me as quite interesting was that the things that they took on board, they then expanded into other areas. So which was a sort of a secret hope all along, because you know, if someone gives you an idea and you think it's a good idea, you tend to use it more. So my gut feeling is yeah, the fact that some of them got to the point that they felt that the structures weren't tremendously helpful for some aspects of this was, we're not helping teachers to be able to take this, but actually if you focus on a relatively you know, teachers who might only be doing this for a few weeks in a term, you know, you can do hermeneutics with 1 passage, but don't do 1 lesson where you do 5 little short quotes. Do a lesson where you do 1 longer passage, and that, you know, so there were some teachers where this would be a relatively small part of their curriculum, and then there were other teachers who would actually be teaching sacred texts all year. So that also interested me, that you seem to have some traction with this in quite contrasting contexts. Now, that's not quite an answer to all your questions. I can't answer all of them, but it's some answer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bob. Bob, did you we've only got a couple of minutes left. Did you want to just say something briefly about the work of Margaret Carswell? Yeah,
the work of Margaret Carswell has been very influential in this. And if you want, you can actually, I put an interview with her. I chatted to her for 35, 40 minutes. and recorded it, and you can get to it from nicer.org.uk and just click Text and Teachers. That interview's there, it's on YouTube. She has done studies in Australia and the UK, dozens of schools, multiple studies, looked at implementing and design different curriculum design. She's critiqued, significantly critiqued primary education programs in the UK and in Australia that she thinks are intellectually weak. And I mean, she's working largely in a Catholic context where the Catholic Church has a lot to say about hermeneutics, and then doesn't and yet there's a problem in the translation into curriculum design. So that's a little bit about her. She's written a number of articles which you can find the links to from that page on that I've referred to on our website. And she's the kind of person where if you're interested in the stuff, then email her, because she's always interested to talk. And she ordinarily comes over for a few months each year and works, but obviously at the moment, because of the travel restrictions, isn't here right now. Otherwise she actually would be at this time.
Bob, I think we really need to say thank you very much. That was very stimulating, and I'll pass back to Catherine.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks, Bob, as well. And if people have got further questions, know that there's one or two more that popped into the chat, and we'll pick those up in the panel session at the end as well. I'm going to hand straight over to Paul, and Sean is going to chair the questions and things at the end of Paul's session as well. So over to you, Paul.
Can you hear me? Yes, no?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. That's always helpful to know that. Okay, and hopefully you can see the screen now here. My screen now disappears. Just on the back of that, I did pop a couple of things into the chat window that are one article from Margaret and a link to her page on her university website, if you're interested. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to download the Menti app, or you've got into the browser. If you have, can you just click on the little heart in the corner, and I can see hopefully people coming into that. The code you need is on top of the slide, but it's 128044. So I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. Yeah, I can see that happening. That's really nice. Excellent. So if you can't get in, don't worry. It's not desperate, and you can see the slides already. But we'll tootle along. It's nice to. If you don't know this piece of software, it's called Mentimeter, and it's quite a nice piece of interactive software for using in virtual teaching. Because here we are. Yay! You may be perhaps not so excited about this time in which we're in, but those of us who've been working in technology education and technology research for a long time are very happy. And let's be fair, you now all know things you didn't know. I bet you thought Zoom was nice lolly, but now you know it's not a nice lolly. It's something else as well. So we're definitely moving into new areas. So very briefly, my name is Paul Hopkins. I've been working in technology and RE for a long time, back in the days when you could still fax stuff, if you remember those things. So I've been doing this research for longer than I care to imagine. It's nice to see lots of old faces on here. I shall just leave that comment where it is. And for those who don't know where Hull is, it's up north, unless you're Stephen, when it's down south. So make up your mind on that choice. So it'd be nice to know who you are. So you have an option now just to tell me what your current role is. And what you should see as you're doing this, you see little dots popping across the screens. That is real-time data. Just like yesterday, it's great to see so many teachers, school teachers here, people still in the classroom. I didn't split that up in terms of whether you're 5 to 11 or possibly EY, or whether you're 11 to 18, but it's good to know. Okay, can I just give that another few seconds? There were 42 of us in the room, so I'm not quite sure how many people managed to get onto the app.
25 so far.
25 so far, yeah. I'm going to assume that's everyone who managed to get on then, because we seem to be sort of stuck there now. So the project that Cullum St Gabriel was very nicely funded is looking really at a number of things. And phase 1 is complete, which is the literature and data collection, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. The teacher interviews, unfortunately, I was also caught in the COVID crisis, as it were. So they've now moved online and have started to take place and will continue through the end of this month and into June. And then I'd hope to get into schools. The big plan this term to be in schools doing some filming and doing some data capture. So we are, what's that wonderful word, reimagining this at the moment. And that'll either take place, and we'll do that more virtually in June, July, or it might be we have to push things back a little bit and do some of that in September, October. We are, as they say, in interesting times. So hopefully there'll be dissemination, well, there will be some dissemination at the REXChange conference in October, however that takes place. And then through the Cullen website, how that's in development, and also through other chapters as well. And there'll be some academic articles as well for those of us working more in the research field. So we're using two sets of models here, really. These are some of the technology models that underpin that. You'll notice in the top right-hand corner is one of my own. So those of you who work in academia will know it's always good to cite yourself. But we're also using a series of models within RE, because the key thing here with any technology use is it's not the technology that drives this, it's the pedagogy. And I didn't have this slide yesterday, so I thought I'd pop it in today because some questions rose up. And I think the thing here, I don't know if you know this is from, I think, the best ever book written about RE, which was Michael Grimmett's edited book on pedagogies in RE. And we're sort of using these kind of frameworks to help teachers situate that in their own, the lessons in their own work. You might be familiar with those. So nipping back then to some of these things, technology when it comes into use in schools, and we're looking here at emergent technologies and new technologies, tends to follow this curve. This is Rogers' innovation curve. So innovators are the people who dash out there and buy technology when it's just newly announced. So I'm not quite sure what that would be at the moment. Maybe electric cars, although we may have moved to the early adopter stage with that. It may be those of you who dashed out and bought drones. Certainly, if you are an innovator, you will have not a VCR in your attic, but you'll have a Betamax tucked away as you rushed out and bought it, and then it went out of fashion. You might be like me, and I was checking recently, I'm now on something like my 14th mobile phone, going back in a whole range of different things. So that idea of early innovators and early adopters. Most of us tend to wait for technology to be reasonably well established before we start to use it. And that's particularly true of schools. Of course it would be, because schools want to wait for things are pretty robust before they jump onto that particular bandwagon. So schools tend to be early majority adopters of technology, or late adopters of technology. And then there's a small group of people who choose not to come into or use technologies. And there are a whole number of reasons for that, which I won't go into at the moment. So what do you think you are? What's your own personal technology adaptation status? Are you an early adopter? I've left out those innovators, but are you an early adopter? Do you jump in fairly quickly? Or are you more cautious and wait a little bit until something's been firmly established, or the price comes down significantly? That's always another quite important part of that. Again, I'm going to assume we have the same number of people as they're clicking in. And what, again, you can see this in real-time data as Mentimeter picks up on that, and how that's changing. Oh, we're looking quite nicely bell curvy here. There we go. I think we had 25 last time, so that's probably about right. Oh, 26 this time. That's very nicely bell curvy. And it won't surprise you to know that sort of fits in with the general populace as you saw in Rogers' curve. So when technologies come in, this is called a Gartner hype cycle, is there tends to be that initial thing of it's going to be amazing. Those of you working in HEIs may recognize the acronym MOOC, the Massive Open Online Courses. And about 3-4 years ago, they were going to shut down universities. There were going to be no need for physical plant and such like anymore. There was a huge amount of hype around MOOCs. And they've not entirely, but mostly gone away. So again, those of you in schools will remember the huge hype around electronic whiteboards. One was bought pretty much every school, particularly in primary. They were rushed into schools, but again, often without, and this is what tends to happen and cause problems, without suitable training or support. So again, those are some things we want to look at. When things get through that, then they hit this trough of delusionment. So technologies go out of fashion very quickly because people find they don't do or don't work what they want to do. And again, this research is driven by two questions that have driven my own research for the last 20 odd years, which is how does technology support your existing practice and how does technology challenge your existing practice? And again, I'll come on to one or two examples of that in a bit, but talk about that really rooted in the teachers who are involved in this and developing their own case studies. So this is the Gartner hype cycle for technology for 2018. 2019 is a little behind at the moment. And you can see some of the things there that are sitting and moving around. I don't know what you personally feel about technology, but again, we'll come back to that at some point in the future. So very quickly, just to flash some of the data past you at this point, we had an N of 91 people filled in the survey questionnaire. If you were one of those, thank you very much. It's not a huge number, but enough data to do some analysis on. Reasonable age spread, a reasonable spread of teachers and other providers, and a reasonable spread of teachers across the sectors, although more in the secondary than the primary sectors, which I wasn't surprised about. When we looked at some technology usage, I just picked out a couple here. You can see that the teachers who filled this in are not game users or virtual reality users. And there are two different sorts of tech here that makes this interesting. Game machines, gaming tends to be younger users. Teachers tend to be a little bit older, moving into that. So gamers was not that surprising. And virtual reality is really quite a new technology. So again, perhaps not surprising in that way. In terms of social media users, quite interesting. Social media has been quite revolutionary, particularly in things like professional development over the last 10 years. And you can see there that 40% of the teachers in this survey said they used, in this case, Twitter. There were other ones as well, but every day. Again, I found that quite surprising. But another quarter, approximately 22%, a fifth to a quarter, said they'd never used it. So again, you can see some of those dichotomies or some of those variances popping up in the data. We're looking at things particularly, so here's an RE specific app. There are probably between about 60 to 100 RE apps out there, although a lot of them are what you might call flat text apps. So there's a lot of sacred texts online. Going back to some of Bob's work, so you'll find Bibles and Qurans and Vedas and scriptures, etc. online, but they tend just to be PDF or physical representations or fairly simple quizzing apps. There are others, but there aren't that many what you might call interactive apps. One that's quite interesting is one called Virtual Desktop Jesus. We have a little virtual reality Jesus who will pop up quite literally onto your desktop, walk around and speak Bible verses at you. And you get a new Bible verse from Virtual Jesus every day. If we look again at this idea of moving from existing technology to emergent technology, which we're really focusing on, you can see here, this is flat presentation technology. So most teachers, well into the 80% of them are using YouTube, Vimeo, presentation software. But if we flip that over to video creation, so making their own video software, you can see that more or less inverts. And I'm interested here, there's quite large chunks of teachers in this survey who reported they're interested in using these technologies, but don't have the opportunities yet. Although there are still quite significant numbers who are saying they're not interested. Again, electronic books, you get a similar kind of pattern, and virtual reality, an even stronger pattern in terms of things that are or aren't possible. Augmented reality, again, the same kind of data. So I know I'm flashing this very quickly, but this data will be available in these slides to have a look at later on. The last piece of data I want to show you is just this awareness of technology or the use of technology in the classroom. And this is quite a small slide, but you can see here again that there's a definite move towards the disagree end in questions around the use of technology or the awareness of technology, although the spread in awareness is wider. Confidence, again, reasonably solid, but quite large chunks of people who are neutral or disagree in terms of feeling confident. And we know that these barriers, one of the things that I do want to pull out are what are the barriers to using technology in the classroom. And we know from the work of people, particularly like Ertmer's work, that confidence is one of those strong barriers, skills is one of the strong barriers, relevance or importance to the subject, how does it support my subject, is a strong barrier. And of course, money or finance resources is a strong barrier. None of those things I'm sure will surprise you. So again, a bit of a chance for you to capture some, well, me to capture some data from you. There's 10 technologies on here. Which of these do you use in your classrooms if you currently teach? And you can choose as many as you like. Is that, there we go. I realise I've got the word mash up there, which you might not know. That's combining different sorts of bits of video together to create your own video. I do love the way this sets a little group of blue dots and then it flings them across the screen as each person contributes. That's brilliant, thank you. And again, we can see here, so lots of people using video. I often feel that there should be a BYT option. Which of us are BYT before YouTube as teachers? Doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it was now. Okay, brilliant, thank you, that's really helpful. So, just a chance then, as I just fill in a bit more about this, in terms of things that you're aware of in terms of technology use. What's out there that you use, particularly in the sense of emergent technology? So are you aware of anything around the use of augmented technologies or virtual reality or artificial intelligence that's currently being used in your field or that you're using in your classrooms? I mentioned, for example, Virtual Jesus. You might have been involved in some of the virtual tours that are taking place. Again, this is very interesting in this time of COVID shutdown. The opportunity to do field trips is quite limited. Although for RE, it's always been much more difficult to get out onto field trips because, again, of those factors around cost and such like. I like the no. I think at the moment, what the data is showing, I think, is that there is not much awareness. There are things out there. So one of the people who's going to be involved in the project, writing a case study, actually does a mobile truck, which allows an immersive Jerusalem or immersive Holy Land experience. And they take their little truck around and children can do a VR visit to the Holy Land in the time of Jesus. Yep, things like TrueTube and such like, but a lot of that, isn't it, is what we might call fairly flat technologies. So it's great, it's reaching across space, but it's not really allowing any kind of interactivity or immersion, what you might call dialogic stuff. I was reminded earlier when Bob was talking about Gadamer's stuff around dialogic action. So last bit of data then is I put up here 6 things that have popped up from the data that people are sort of highlighting, these teachers in the sample are highlighting as what they think is the most important new or emergent tech. None of this is absolutely new, but might be new to you. You can rank these. You should be able to pull these into an order. So which of these do you think are currently the most important thing? And again, this will be useful feedback as we develop the case studies to know which areas we should focus and concentrate on. Again, you'll see these as people vote on different ones. The software is aggregating that and putting those into an order. But this is the closest you're going to get to sport in the lockdown situation here, so enjoy this. I already put a bet on which is going to win. I feel I should do a sort of like sports commentator overlay on this now, in terms of who's creeping up or runners and riders. Okay, we got to 30 people last time, so that's again, that's really interesting. The fact that RE specific apps, and there are 1 or 2 out there. In fact, I mentioned there are 60 to 100 apps out there if you search the Apple Store or the Android Store, but many of those are very based around scriptural knowledge or scriptural transmission, and there are quite a lot again of that barrier. I think that RE tension always between what is RE and what is the faith bodies, and who is promoting those things. So a lot of apps are being pushed out by faith communities. Is that RE? Is that not RE? That's perhaps a different research project. So what do we still have to do? We still have to complete the interviews and arrange the case studies with that problem with access, but we're putting along with that, and I have great confidence that we'll be ready to have a good amount of material ready for September, and by the end of the year at the end. Okay, so I was going to talk for about 20 minutes. I've done 18. So if you could pop some questions you've got them into the chat meeting on GoToMeetings, and I will stop sharing my screen and go back to the main chat window. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul. You certainly sparked off a lot of nostalgia with people loving to remember their OHPs and whiteboards. And quite people would like to have a virtual Jesus popping up on the desktop as well.
I don't know how many of you have used VR either in gaming or itself, but again, there are some problems around that. There are some interesting research being done on the nature of using virtual reality and its psychological and, in fact, physiological impact on people. Most people tend to get a bit sick quite quickly when using VR, but the option to be able to move and walk around something in virtual space is quite an interesting thing to do. And if you've not had a chance, have a go sometime. These technologies are now really quite available. Okay, sorry.
Okay, well, I've got some questions coming up. And so if I could ask Jill to ask her question, please.
Hello there, thank you for your presentation, really interesting, and love the Mentimeter. I'm going to try and give that a go. I'm focused in the primary sector, and I'm just wondering, is there somewhere central we can access some of these technologies? Is there anywhere that you could perhaps guide us to or recommend that we could sort of explore and have a go at using them?
It's a tricky one at the moment. So since the demise of local authorities, this has got much more difficult. So in the days of local authorities, there was always that sort of central advisor. Certainly, it's always worth trying to talk. There are still RE advisors out there who may know this sort of stuff. Because this is focusing on the more emergent end of the technologies, I think at the moment we are starting to look at developing case study options. I think the first port of call I'd always go is to look, just do some searching on things like the Apple Store or the Google Play Store in looking for apps. Do you have things like tablets in your school?
Okay.
So that's a good place to start, because there's a lot of augmented reality, for example, apps that will run just through a tablet. So augmented reality, for those you don't know, is where you'll have something on your screen, the camera is picking up your real environment, and there's data overlaid on that. So there's lots of commercial stuff out there. Starbucks does an augmented reality Starbucks, so you can hold your phone up wherever you are in a world, in a city, and it will direct you to the nearest Starbucks. Now, I know at one level that's superficial, but often these things come in the commercial sector first. There are a growing number, several of the Berlin churches have done augmented overlays now, so you can be in, for example, the cathedral in Berlin, and you hold your camera up, it will scan a code or a reader, and it will give you data or information on an artifact or an object. You can build those yourselves, and there's a number of augmented reality apps where you can build using QR codes, using other things, develop those apps yourself. And again, that's something that one of the case study people is looking at, the use of augmented reality using quick read or QR apps. That doesn't entirely answer your question, Jill, I'm sorry. There's no easy central thing. I mean, again, it may well be that something that comes out of this project or a future project is a sort of repository of apps. The problem with that is it changes so rapidly. So there are now over 1 billion apps downloaded every year from the Apple Store. I've not seen the data on the Android Store. Unbelievable amounts of this stuff is now out there and created. If you know enthusiastic sixth formers doing computing studies and A-level computing studies and A-level RS, there's a project.
Thank you.
Now, a slightly different question, but similar from Bronwyn, and it was about the technology. So, Bronwyn, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes, I'm in the older age group here, but I find all of this fascinating, and just wondered if there was a sort of central source. I think you already answered the question, really, but thank you very much. I think very often you're right. We just need to ask our teenage students. They're always really helpful whenever anything goes wrong in the classroom. But is there anything else you can add to where we can find out some more information, please?
I think when using technology in the classroom, there's almost sort of 3 stages. The first stage is to ask what technology exists that you use already that can be bent to an RE type modality. And I'll just give an example of that in terms of revisioning things. So Danger's getting older, isn't it? What I think is 10 years ago, I then check and it turns out to be 25 years ago. So, but a number of years ago, I did a project called Email a Believer. And we had a group of, I was working in Derbyshire at the time, and we were doing some work around Judaism, but there are no, exaggerate, but there were no Jews in Derbyshire, at least a bit of Derbyshire where we were inhabiting. So it was difficult to get hold of real believers to talk about this. So we contacted a school in Nottingham, a Jewish school in Nottingham, and we exchanged emails. Now, if I was doing that now, I'd be doing that through a WhatsApp group or through a Zoom or a Skype or a GoToMeetings. So, but the core underlying thing there is about religious dialogue, about faith dialogue. I mean, that's coming back to the first question I'd always ask is, what do I want to do? And then what technologies allow me to do that? The flip side of that is to be challenged by stuff. So say, oh, okay, there's this thing called WhatsApp, which lets me get groups together collaboratively. Oh, which group would it be good to get collaboratively? And one of the fascinating things that came out of the Email a Believer project was the kind of questions about religion that the 14-year-olds, I was working secondary at the time, I worked in primary as well, wanted to ask each other, were not necessarily the questions that I, as the teacher, or the syllabus wanted the children to ask. So there's a slight tension there. But actually, one of my strongest memories was this long email exchange between a 14-year-old bat mitzvah and a kid in my school. And the main topic was, bat mitzvah was great because you got lots of presents. But what underpinned that was the idea about celebration and rejoicing. So, you know, really powerful emergent stuff came out from something which the technology facilitated, but didn't create. And again, I think that kind of things are possible. And again, one other quick example of that in terms of the change is when I first did video work, we had to get the video camera from the local authority, and it came in a truck with a technician, and it was about £10,000 worth of kit. Well, I carry around with me, as most of you will, a better video camera with built-in editing software in my pocket every day than that £10,000 where the camera could do 15, 20 years ago. So again, the option of getting children to capture video, to make video around statements of faith, around beliefs of faith, about places they visit, around a whole range of things. There are lots of possibilities out there. And the smartphone, in a sense, is a developing and emergent technology. So that's one I think we're interested in. Might have been half an answer.
Thank you. That's really, really, really useful and helpful. Thanks.
Well, that's perfect use of technology and perfect timing. So I think it's probably time to go back to Catherine and the plenary. Is that right, Catherine?
Super. Thanks ever so much, Sean. I want to begin with a question that came a little bit earlier, which we didn't get a chance to explore. And Alexis Stones, I wonder if you would like to ask your question that was particularly for Bob, but might also apply to what Paul's been talking about as well, in terms of initial teacher training. And you particularly asked about hermeneutics, but I wonder if it might apply to the digital technologies as well. And we'll open it up to any panel member to answer, but perhaps, Alexis, you'd like to come and ask your question.
Oh, thanks, Catherine. Sorry, I just ran downstairs to check on to do a child thing, and I've just run up, so I didn't get the first part of what you were asking. Could you say that again, please?
Yeah, sorry, Alexis, earlier in the chat, you were asking a question about ITE, and yes, relating to what Bob was saying, but I was wondering whether actually it might also connect with what Paul was saying. So because we're in a kind of plenary panel session, the questions are kind of open to anyone in the panel group to answer. So Bob, Paul, Kevin, myself, Stephen, Sean can chip in.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll get the ball rolling. Just strikes me. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Bob, and thanks, Paul. It just strikes me, just going back to Bob's presentation on his work with his colleagues, that this really needs to happen in ITE, doesn't it, as early as possible. And it strikes me that we're dealing with lots of other unhelpful phenomena, such as that science and religion divide, but we're coming at it through hermeneutics, through these different readings, as opposed to sort of head on in a potentially antagonistic way, coming at it through a disciplinary way that is also the personal as well as the public too. I think loads of yeah, so I'm really keen to pursue that for ITE. I don't know if other people are. And maybe just to link it to what Paul was saying, we've been working with video maker colleagues at the Institute of Education to look at animation and those different readings, sort of hermeneutics through animation. And a not yet developed field, but watch this space. So yeah, just really love to work with any colleagues on those ideas, but definitely I think ITE, if there are subgroups or something that people are interested in, I'd be really keen to be a part of that. Thank you.
I'm happy to say something on that. Shall I do that, Catherine?
Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
I mean, the real I wrote a blog a year or so back that was on RE Online that was raising a challenge for ITE, which is because disciplines are quite diverse and disciplines within them have different sorts of approaches to asking questions and activities, and the sort of activity design might shift. So because we have a very wide plurality of potential disciplines, what do you want to help your teachers learn to do first in their year could be really important. How do you, I mean, obviously questioning and how we ask questions, for example, is one key area of importance that particularly important for hermeneutics. And the example there would be, you know, if you say, what does this text mean? You have posited all sorts of loaded things into that question already. You've kind of implied there's a meaning. There might be many meanings. You haven't really necessarily said what do we mean by meaning, or how is it significant? What meaning does it have? And some people say, well, what meanings might a text hold, or what meanings might a text be sort of compatible with or tolerant of? That's a sort of more, that comes from sort of Umberto Eco's approach to texts. So you've got a kind of really basic things like, how do we ask questions? You mentioned the science religion thing. Some of us will have known from the watching the recent politicians. There's this kind of tendency towards a science says. It's not quite what they're saying, but it's pretty close. Science says this, which is a bit like the Bible says that. Well, science doesn't say one thing. There are many scientists who say things, sometimes different sorts of things, sometimes contradictory things, based on different sorts of studies that they do. So there is a sort of thing about how we build, if you like, an answer, a permitted answer space by the very question we structure in. And I think what we must do is teachers deserve to be given space in their education, in their training, in their early phase of formation, to have enough time to focus on questioning, because questioning is so important for RE. And I think so I can see there being general applications to what we might choose to do, but the thing is, can we how much can we do? What do we need to do first? And that's a harder question to answer, but that was my comment, really.
Okay, do any of the other panel members want to chip in on this one in terms of IT? I know, Paul, you're involved with IT as well, I think, aren't you still?
Oh, okay. It's really hard, isn't it? So my secondary RE IT course was shut down by Michael Gove a few years ago. And we had space in that, so there were options of doing that. And certainly this whole idea of truth claims was something which we worked very strongly on. I would argue, it's very hard, isn't it? But if anything is very central for me to the teaching of RE, it's this important truth claim. And gosh, isn't the idea of examining and critically examining truth claims something which is rather vital at the moment? I currently work on a primary ITE course, and I'll be brutally honest with you, RE gets about 2 hours, about half a day's input on our primary PGCE course. And that's more than some. The data's out there and what's out there, and I'm not entirely happy with that. It's not, I don't actually do the RE on our primary PG. What can you do in half a day? in that. There's a real sort of struggle and tension there. Those of you who work in primary will know, 12 subjects to cover, overemphasis on maths and English, interpretation in that original thing. I work on the science for our PG. So I think there are real complications in RE and what to choose. But I'd agree with Bob. I think if anything comes back to that, it's that critical questioning. If we can work on the idea of critical questioning, I think we're giving children a phenomenal thing. A project, I know it's still around, called SUPERE, the Society for the Advancement of Philosophical Reflection and Education, used to work a lot in that kind of area. I don't they're still going. A wonderful chap called Matthew Lipman, no relation to Maureen, set it up many years ago. I think from New Zealand it came. And P4E, Philosophy for Kids, for P4C, I think it's also still out there. So those things are around. But yeah, ITE, there's no easy solution, I think, especially for primary ITE.
Thanks, Paul. I wonder if I might bring in Helen Norman. Helen's been making a few comments about primary ITE actually in the chat. And Helen, I was just wondering if you were willing perhaps to just share a little bit about what you discussed in your staff meeting, and any particular things you think that perhaps those working in IT and providing IT might think about.
I think a really big thing was I was shocked how little RE all our staff had. So the majority of, as I say, the most that anyone had ever said they'd had was 1 day's worth of RE training. And I was shocked because I did a PGCE and I did a week's worth of 5 lessons on each of the main religions. And I couldn't believe someone could finish a 4-year course and have no training apart from 2 hours where a lot of the staff said they were literally given a pack. Here's a pack on Sikhism, here's a pack on Christianity, here's a pack on Islam, and that's all they got. And it means that when you're trying to answer all these big questions, most people don't know where to start.
Okay, does anyone want to comment on that? While you're thinking about it, I will just chip in. I know Linda Whitworth's put this in the chat as well. We had a funded project to develop some resources, a course and a toolkit for primary IT providers that's on the Teach RE website. I'll try and put something in the chat before we finish. And at the moment we have, I think, over 700 primary teachers, or primarily beginner teachers actually, doing the 12-hour, well, it's designed to be 12-hour course. It's a self-study course and it's free. So that provides something, but it then requires the initiative largely of beginner teachers to do it, unless they're told they have to do it. But that's been provided specifically to try, well, to be one thing to try and fill that gap. It's not an answer, but it's part of the solution. Linda, I know you're not officially on the panel, but I wondered if you want to chip in here with some comments on that.
Yeah, I think there's, I think the problem is not getting any better, although we know more about it now. And so the course that's up on the Culham site, it's a starter, but it's no more than that. When it gets down to things like giving primary teachers confidence to think hermeneutically, that needs a lot of time, and the problem is getting time to ITE courses. But not only time to ITE, but it's also where it goes in terms of any CPD. And I'm terrified when I hear conversations that have comments about pacts on Islam and pacts on Hinduism and so on, because that's also really worrying, this idea that you can deliver a religion as a lump and give it to someone and say that's what you're teaching, because that that removes all the dialogic, or all the higher quality things we're all talking about. So obviously there's lots of work to be done there. I've put my email up for anyone who wants to contact me about this.
Thanks, Linda, so much. So any of the other panel members want to chip in on this?
I think it's very
just going back.
Okay,
is it me?
Kevin, go for it. I think Stephen might have something to say as well. First.
I go ahead.
Okay.
Just going back to the original question for Bob. I've just noted that a very promising follow-up project for him and his colleagues, together with an interested group of ITE tutors, would be a project about hermeneutical approaches within religion and worldviews, initial teacher education, and with a focus on questioning, that would also have cross-curricular applications. That could be a very good development, I think.
Thanks, Kevin. Stephen, did you want to add something?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Catherine. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fascinating conversation, everybody. We're back to that issue of what should be done in ITE, and perhaps the question is what can be done in ITE. How much time is there? How much space? On a PGD primary, there's very little space, even on an undergraduate course. Little space for RE. Even if you get something optimum, it's still not a great deal. Then we're back to that other big issue about CPD. Now, I'm a great believer that we need to get beyond the barriers. We need to get ITE and further CPD linked together, because I'm also a great believer that as we send students out from ITE into schools, and even if we do provide them with some kind of half-decent foundation in religious education, quite often that good foundation is knocked out of them in some of the schools. Not all of the schools, I'm not being pejorative here, but that's why we need to keep reminding people, somehow break those barriers, bring them back, provide further information. One of the interesting things at the moment is there's so much going on. There's lots of interesting things going on with religion right now in lockdown. It'd be great to get these kind of conversations going. It might be that we don't do the traditional day event. We do them online. We do them through social media. But I think it's time. I really like what St. Gabriel's is doing, but I think it's time to think just a bit more creatively about that long professional journey people have got and the way in which they engage with RE. Sorry, that was very long.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, I'm going to take us to a question. I'm hoping I've got the right one, jotted it down. Helen, oh no, Kevin, sorry, it was Kevin Tickle, I think, had a question about kind of the transition between primary and secondary, which I thought was really interesting. Kevin, do you want to share your question?
Hi. It's actually Sarah. I'm on my husband's computer. But yeah, the question I had really was, how can we, as secondary teachers, approach primary teachers and offer our support without kind of coming across condescending? Really, the intake that we get is really patchy. We've got some faith school kids who've obviously got quite a lot of Christianity focus, but know very little about some of the other religions. Some of the kids come knowing a lot about all of them. Some of them come and say, oh, I never did RE because I was taken out for this, that and the other. So it's hard to build a curriculum when you've got no clear starting point. So I'd like to offer support to the primaries, but I don't want to come across as being like condescending or, you know, this is how we would like it. I think it's quite a hard thing to do.
Okay, who'd like to tackle that one? Sean, have you got some thoughts on this one? As a secondary teacher.
No, I was, yeah, it's difficult. I tend to think it's more the other way. I think sometimes primary school teachers are doing great things with children, and when they get to secondary school, we kind of dumb them down for about 6 months to a year. And I know that sometimes I've taught students who are doing the stuff in year 5, and I haven't listened to what primary colleagues are saying. And so it is difficult. I mean, we've tried through a few things in my school of working with year 6, but it's just hard to sort of get. We haven't yet got the idea of having teacher meets with primary colleagues and secondary teachers. We do it just as secondary or just as primary, and we're not enough about thinking about interacting. That's maybe it's just we're just too much into our secondary primary silos.
That's really interesting, Sean. And it's just put actually in the comments, Catherine Taylor's just put about a more integrated approach across the 4 key stages as well. And I know one of the things that I've noticed is that there can be quite a difference, even in agreed syllabuses and so on, between what's expected or what the view of RE can be in primary and secondary, which I think is interesting. I've just asked Claire Clinton if she would chip in on this one, because Claire, I know, works as primary and secondary as an advisor. Claire, would you like to just sort of chip in with some thoughts on this one?
Yes, what I do every year is I collect pupils' work, partly through competition that we run in Newham, which is around visiting places of worship or having interaction with people from different religions and worldviews. So that might be an essay, it might be something creative, all sorts of things. Anyway, and through going in and doing booklets and different bits like that, supporting teachers, I build up a bank of work through the year. And what I always do in my primary and my secondary network meetings, but particularly in the secondary, is I give them a range of work. And it might be from year 10, it might be from year 7, year 8, but also year 4, year 5, year 6. And it is hilarious every year when people have to rate what child, how old was this child who wrote this? Now they know the game now because I've done it so many times, but the first few times I did it, they could not believe, the secondary teachers could not believe how capable the primary schools were. And also, if they're not aware of what challenge, so for instance, that they've done textual criticism in year 5 and year 6 for us, looking what Bob's been talking about earlier, we just see that as normal. And actually, if Key Stage 3 is not planning on the back of that, then the kids are really bored in RE, basically. So real examples, I think, are a practical way that you can very easily educate secondary, as well as upscale everybody's expectations of what's possible.
Thanks, Claire. Paul?
Can I add something to that?
Oh, sorry.
I've been doing some work, not in RE, but the principal may come across, is we do something called transition units in science. And what we do, Sarah, is we get our year 6 and our year 7s to develop a project that can start in year 6 post-SATs. I know this year post-SATs is not an option, but any of you who work in primary will know that the 3rd week in May is a joyous time. Okay, the 2nd week in May, not so good, but the 3rd week in May is a fantastic time. Okay, and all sorts of things start to happen. If you can develop a project that could start in year 6 and finish in year 7, that gives you that sense of continuity. So one that comes to mind, for example, is the kids in year 6 could be visiting a place of worship, collecting data, collecting artifacts, collecting resources. And in year 7, you bring that together to do a critical analysis or critical appraisal of the purposes of practice of worship in that place. That's top of the head stuff. Which is always a bit dodgy. But so we've been doing that for science. And I think I can see it working for RE as well. And that is very much a collaborative thing. So you don't come across, hopefully, as I'm the expert, listen to me, which I know is your concern. And I'm really pleased you have that concern. You come across as, how can we work together to develop this subject area?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you.
Bob, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just quickly, if I may. I think that and it really goes back to what we think we're doing in our subject and what we think, therefore, transition means. If we think that transition means oh no, I've got 180 children and like they haven't learned all the same amounts of stuff in the same boxes of the religions that I'm teaching because I wanted them to know about that amount of stuff, then you've got no solution. There's no solution to that. Well, the only solution is possibly you only ever teach children in their religious schools and that's it, sort of thing. That's not, you can't fix that. But if you think, well, actually our subject has a kind of disciplinary heart and it has a hermeneutical heart, if you think that, and then you think, where are they doing hermeneutics in their primary school? Because they've been doing that since they learned languages, since they learned their first language. They're doing it in art. They're doing it when they are trying to understand themselves and represent themselves figuratively. They're doing textual criticism and talking about authors and audiences in literacy. They're doing that whole bundle of things that we can build on top of. But you kind of need to kind of uproot yourself from thinking that what we're doing is teaching them 6 little boxes of religion or 6 plus humanism or whatever, and you have to kind of go through this sort of imaginative leap. The problem that you're going to have with that is if you can't teach a curriculum that helps you to do that, which I think is part of the big problem that we've got, because we've got curriculum that are sort of formed in a different way. But I do think you can, the business of hermeneutics goes on across most subjects, if not all subjects. And there are lots of opportunities for building. I think we could have done this in project entirely with primary schools with very little change to the level of complexity taught. I frequently give lectures to 14-year-olds, 19-year-olds and 25-year-olds, and I don't change the lecture. So we need to sort of slightly all that level stuff, and yeah. You've noticed. There was another point that I was going to say, because time's almost out and I'm conscious, and it's just the opportunity that this subject has now. I mean, we've got this extraordinary situation that we're in, and it's a terrible situation. It's you know, by the time we get to a year down the line, the number of people who will have died will be huge. Bereavement will be a massive issue. Where is the conversation going to happen? Who are the teachers who can hold the space for that conversation? So there are all sorts of problems with the resourcing for teachers and the preparation of teachers, but there's also a huge, actually it's a responsibility for our subject to understand what role it must play in the next 5 or 6, well, 6 or 7 years as we move hopefully out of, but certainly through this crisis, because there are many teachers who, you know, don't have the confidence and space to open up and go into, you know, dangerous territories. I think this is RE's time for it to sort of, you know, show its service actually for schools. I know it's sort of out of the blue there, but I think it's important for us to remember this, certainly on a Friday afternoon before we go for our cups of tea or possibly something a little bit stronger.
Thanks, Paul, so much. Okay, there aren't, as far as I can see, any specific questions coming, although the chat has been very busy with lots of comments and things from people. So do check that out in the next minute or so. What I'm going to do is I'm going to invite us now, if you are happy, to just turn on your camera if you haven't already, and we'll take a nice little picture, a screenshot of everybody. And then after that, I'm just going to invite Stephen to say a few words before we finish together. Let's give it a few seconds if you want to turn on your camera. I like Paul's hat.
My Dr. Seuss hat.
Okay. Okay. Stephen, do you want?
Sorry, Catherine, blocking.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. This has been a wonderful success over the 2 days, and I'm so grateful to Catherine and Kevin for all the work they've done, to Bob and Sean. It's been an experiment, and there's always been a wee bit of anxiety about trying to do this, but we think it's been just great. Thank you so much for your participation. It's great to see so many well-kent faces. For me, it's tinged with a little bit of sadness, because today we would have been saying goodbye at our 2020 RE conference. And that's really disappointing that it didn't take place this year. But this has cheered everybody up. We will be back. RE will be back, hopefully next year. We hope many of you will join us. Join us to engage at this level. And I hope everybody keeps safe and well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Stephen. A couple of people just been asking in the chat about, will there be a video version? We hope there'll be a podcast version, and all the presentations will be available online as well. So the PowerPoints, Paul will sort out his presentation with the data today, which is very slightly different than yesterday. I know that there was mentioned earlier about the research that Vivian and Karen are doing at Exeter, and Sam Brown has just put a message into the chat about if you would like to take part in that. I know someone privately messaged me during the session saying they're interested. You've actually got Sam's email there if you want to directly contact her about that. That's taking part in interviews and things about teachers' engagement in and with research. So there's lots of links there. I won't go sign us off straight away in case you want to go back through the chat and have a quick look. We will keep the chat, but that will just be for our internal use to start with, and just to follow up any people that wanted to connect after today. After that, we will then destroy the chat. Thank you so much for joining us. Agree with Stephen, it's been tinged with sadness, but it's also been great to see so many people, and great to have so many teachers involved as well over the last couple of days. So just a final thank you to me for everyone who's taken part yesterday and today, and enjoy the weekend.